Welcome to the smartest people in the room. We are glad you are here, and just by showing up, you're already demonstrating your very own smarts. Today, I am pleased to present two guys who are digital music experts, and I promise you will leave smarter and more enlightened than you arrived. First, to the audience, before we get started, let me lay down some ground rules. First, please feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat window. The reason we do these webinars is twofold. First, we want to showcase really smart people and the amazing work they do day to day in the music industry. But the second reason is a bit more nuanced. Many of you know that I am a music industry headhunter. I run the music practice at Turnkey ZRG, and I place music executives in roles throughout the industry. So by definition and function, I help people connect with companies. And in this series, my goal is to help you make more connections, and I invite you to take full advantage of the opportunity. Specifically, I want you to I want you to introduce yourselves to other members of the chat. I want you to ask questions of our speakers, and above all else, I just want you to be enlightened and inspired by what you learned today. Also, this is important. Please make sure your chat is set to address everyone, not just the host and speakers. I want to thank our program sponsors, for without their support, we could not keep this series free. Special thanks to MedJet, Turnkey ZRG, the Tennessee Entertainment Commission, Tennessee Brew Works, and Better Than Booze. So let's get down to business. Huey. Dick is a Pacific Northwest US-based entrepreneur and digital music consultant. His music career began as a performer and music manager, which led to global head of digital role at independent record label powerhouse, the Beggars Group, in New York City in 1997. In 2002, he founded Toolshed, an early digital marketing consultancy. Toolshed created digital campaigns for hundreds of artists and many of the world's top independent record labels, including Beggars Group, Touch and Go, Merge Records, Saddle Creek, and Kill Rock Stars. Through Toolshed, Dick led Spotify's U.S. independent label music license acquisition efforts prior to their 2011 U.S. launch, and build advisory relationships with Red Bull, TuneCore, Digital Rights Agency, 8 Tracks, Jacksta, Paper Chain, and Section School, which is Scott Galloway's 2020 ed tech startup. He served for 9 years on the board of Sound Exchange and represented Matador Records. He was a past executive director and board chair of the Future of Music Coalition. And outside of music, he's a USSA certified ski coach with a passion for gardening. Talk about a Swiss Army knife of talent. Welcome back, Dick. So great to have you here, my friend.
Thank you very much, Tom.
And joining him as today's featured guest is Michael Pelczynski. He's a recognized innovator in the music industry, shaping the future of music rights, digital economics, and AI-driven business models. With a career spanning strategic leadership roles at major music and tech companies, he has been instrumental in evolving the streaming economy, advancing IP rights and licensing frameworks, and pioneering ethical AI practices. As co-founder and chief strategy and impact officer at VoiceSwap, Mike leads vision, partnerships, and policy engagement, ensuring AI voice technology is developed with transparency, accountability, and legislative foresight. He launched the first technical certification for AI voice models in partnership with BMAT, setting a new industry benchmark. Mike also serves as EVP of Digital Strategy and Distribution at Rostam Pacific, overseeing AI integrated distribution and business development via its Space Eater arm. He previously developed SoundCloud's fan-powered royalties, the first user-centric payout model at scale, and held strategic roles at Warner Music Group focused on licensing, catalog economics, and digital rights optimization. A former BMG songwriter and Libera Awards semifinalist, Mike brings a creator's lens to his strategic work. He's the founder of consultancies Forums and Shapes, and is a frequent speaker at industry events, drawing on a cross-sector career to bridge creativity, policy, and innovation, shaping the future of music with fairness, foresight, and economic impact. It is my pleasure to welcome these two rock stars to our platform today. Take it away, boys.
Thank you, Tom.
Thank you, Tom. Mike,
All right.
here we are. Okay. I have so many questions to ask you that I'm gonna dive right in. And just to I want to set the stage, I guess, a little bit first. So, as one of the really fun parts about doing this with you is I had the opportunity to go back and read all of your writing, some of which I'd missed over the years. Um, and I realized that I first found out about you at Nylon Connect in 2023. You were on a panel there. I don't think we met then, but we did meet at Indie Week, um, and last year at Indie Week.
It felt like we've met each other much, 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 much longer ago. That
I
meeting.
felt the
Just
same
want to, just
way.
want to tell that, say that out loud for everybody.
All right, say it out loud. Put it out there. Brother from a different mother, however you want to say
Absolutely. Just
it.
to call that out.
Fair enough. I appreciate that. I feel the same way. And just to contextualize that, we had really different music paths, really different ones, but they were very parallel in a lot of ways. You think you and I think in a very similar fashion about sort of developments in the digital media space, but coming from opposite ends of the opportunity, so to speak. So that's really interesting to me. And as I mentioned, um, oops, hosts and panelists. Hang on a second here. I made a mistake. Let me correct something real quick and pop this back into the chat. There. Okay. Sorry about that, Mike.
All good.
Um, so you started out at a major label. First Atlantic, you were an intern there. You moved into business development. And then you went to Warner. You were seeing bands. You are a performer. You were doing rights administration, and I was on this parallel track at the growing independent beggars group. Running their new media and seeing shows and sort of living the Lower East Side scene as kind of as a label guy and a recovering band manager. And super exciting the space that I was in, and starting my consultancy. And I really just had not realized our degree of overlap from these different ends. And I'd love to have you talk for a little bit about your early experience around digital music.
Sure. And I mean, I have to say that just also, I know your background and just hearing also Tom walk it through just now is, just want to say I'm honored to be on here with you. And I think even just speaking about the parallel paths, it's almost like before diving into maybe the beginning of my journey is just the biggest reward you can have in this gig in this industry is when you cross paths with people with those parallel kind of journeys and you in that moment where you just go, how the hell did we not ever meet prior to this, whatever it was. Um, so just wanted to say that too. Um, so yeah, going back 20 something years ago, I don't know, short of 25 years ago was when I came on to the new media business development team as a temp at Warner during the ringtone era, which was absolutely fascinating to show up completely green to what the music industry was from a business perspective. But I was heavily engaged in music on the creative side and the DJ community and music band culture. Um, and also my family too. My family musicians, so it's always been at home. So it was just interesting to show up when there was this moment of, I'd say, disruption, but opportunity. Like there's this opportunity of disruption of stakeholders in that group, which were George White, Michael Nash. They were running that department. Um, and it was amazing hearing them and seeing them operate in a way that they were basically showing everyone what the potential ringtones are, and then seeing that just hockey stick up. Not that long after that dissipated obviously a bit. But it was fascinating to show up right at that moment because you saw how certain people thought and operated and had vision while they're working in a very traditional side of the business or within the traditional side of the business. So how much they were pushing against also just the business at large. Um, so I was lucky. because it wasn't like I came into rights admin or marketing or anything else at the time, which you would then start to see it from that kind of traditional lens as opposed to coming in from that different lens. And then soon after that, I had an opportunity. There was some open roles. There was something in marketing. There was something in rights, administration, and royalties. They gave me a chance to choose. I, of course, chose rights, admin, and royalties. And they asked me why wouldn't I take marketing? And I respectfully said I wanted a job longer than 2 years, and I wanted to know if I'm looking at money. I know everyone has to talk to me, and I have to talk to them. But not against anything about people in marketing. It was just at the time, I remember it was really difficult, let alone today, to work in marketing. So it was really an interesting kind of pivot to just come in at that sign of things, of how technology is reacting to what was happening already in 2003. We were responding to the whole P2P disruption. And that was the other thing too, is they were managing and creating partnerships with interdiction firms. So basically companies that were coming in and helping Warner and partners to just really pollute those P2P platforms, create friction,
Mhm.
and let's just go 20 years forward and it repeats itself, right? This is what we're trying to do with generative AI. But obviously, that first step in doing something like that, you still need then thoughtful design to create the commercial prospect of that, right? So it's just, and you know better than most, right? It's that history is really important. That experience is really important because when you're there, even just participating, little, maybe contributing even, you get to be able to do that again in the future, which we're doing it all over again, but with a different problem and a different opportunity, right? Yeah.
Yes, we are. And it's interesting that you mentioned the I guess the framing of the time that you were in, because that was one of the things that in preparing for this got me thinking about what was happening in the music scene and in the business scene at the same time at that time. So there was a really, in my music scene, it felt like endless possibility time.
Yeah.
We felt like, oh, we're the indies. We can kind of do what we can break some ground here. We can, let the slow majors do their own thing, and we can be out on the forefront.
Hmm.
And I expect from your side, I mean, you already talked about the seeding bit that was going on, but it was a pretty serious time in the music industry. It was not, what, 4 years before
Mhm.
the big crash, so to speak. I mean,
Yeah.
what was it like? What was it like being in the scene on your end of it at that point?
It's really interesting that you bring this up because it was the difference between walking into an office and then walking into the Lower East Side and or the Village
Yeah.
and in New York. And walking into the office, it was a very different environment than walking in the evening, late night into neighborhoods of New York where indie music was just in its heyday or getting to its heyday, like to what you just said, right? Like that indie music defined by whatever that is in that era. It was just you wanted to go out, you're finding new music, new bands, new people, the community, there was a buzz. During a time when music's just being hit really, the business is being hit really hard. And it was so interesting, actually, at the time you had, even though you're going into the office and you're going into the bar or the club, you're still kind of not realizing the disconnect because you knew at the time this one has to figure out what has to happen, and this one's already doing its job, right? Music's doing its job, culture's doing its job, counterculture is becoming culture slowly. Um, but then it was actually on the business side, right? It was almost like there was counterculture that came and disrupted everything. And then music business culture was disrupted. And then in order to save itself, it has to find business counterculture and adopt the right means and the right things to then. So it's interesting. Like actually, I haven't even thought about that in years. And I wouldn't have even thought about it at the time, but it was, yeah, the part of going into the office was challenging, exciting, and stressful in a very different way than going out into the music scene, which just there was nothing challenging about it. It was just rewarding. It was just discovery and just figuring out where to go, like because there was so much going on at the time. Um, yeah, I haven't thought about that in years.
Yeah, it's funny that it felt endless to me too, and for a long time it just felt like, oh, this is just a um it's an open port, like kind of try and experiment with all these things. And then I remember one day at Beggars, I got my first negative letter. I won't say what artist it was from, but it was an excoriating letter about participating in digital music. And
Mm.
I think I
What
read
year?
it.
What years around? Like what year around?
It was around the turn of the
Yeah.
century. Um,
Mhm.
and it floored me. I mean, I read it over and over and over again. Uh, and thought, wow, like it's like I was already near the finish line, I felt like, and all of a sudden I was realizing, wait, this isn't a universal experience at all. People are seeing this in a really different way, and I was big moment of insight. But anyway, I actually want to go back before we get too deeply into the label side of you. I want to go back even a little bit further because your parents come from Poland, and they came over. They were both musicians, as I understand it. They
Mhm.
came over to sort of escape the Cold War and move to Greenpoint. Um, and in one of your more recent blog posts on your Forms and Shapes blog, you talked about sort of your understanding of the music world and how you got where you are. And you had this favorite line of mine that I mentioned in our pre-chat, which is, if you don't define what matters to you, the world will do it for you. And I love that insight. So can you talk about that insight a little bit and how that grew out of the experience, of growing up in Greenpoint?
Yeah, it is. It was it was a time because when my parents came here to the States, they were leaving Poland at a time that they were basically they were fairly successful in Poland. However successful you can be during, that era of communism and the curtain and all that. And they even were allowed to tour in some areas of Central Eastern Europe. Um, so they found some significant success out there. They even had a music video in 1968 or something like that, and there was only one TV station, TVP1.
Mhm.
It's on YouTube. Is probably my when someone says, "What's your craziest internet story that the internet gifted you?" Is I never saw my father as a young man. He was a little older when they had me, so there's no pictures that he took home out here with him. So finding that video in black and white just blew my mind. But it was a way that they didn't really talk about that much. They didn't talk about that era of their life. And it was mostly because they're like, okay, you're here. Like this is the life you have to live, and you can live, and you have to choose what you want with your life, right? We're here for a reason. Originally came to Chicago and then ended up in Greenpoint and then in Northern Jersey. But it was one of those lessons that they kept trying to teach me in non-direct ways, which was, what is it that you're trying to choose or what is it that you're trying to do? I ultimately tried to rebel against what they do, their professions of music. It didn't work because it's in my blood. Um, but it did gift a lot of things because it gifted me the ability to understand what matters and what I'm passionate about. May it be music on the creative side of it, may it be on the business side. And honestly, I don't separate the two because they're the whole thing. Um, and it really is about choosing and them really making that evident to me over the years as I got older. And I'm watching them here struggle because again, you're leaving everything and you're coming here to escape something. And that was even after martial law broke out back home. So there was tensions and what's happening to the family that's left there. Um, and it really did create this situation of as I got older, I realized I have to do good by myself and I have to do good by the people that are the closest to me, my family, my friends, because there was sacrifice done there, right? And I watched them grow up in this community that they were, I would say, one of the community leaders because they would constantly work a nightclub that was not far from where we were living. It was a hub that, they hosted. It was a restaurant, ballroom, bar. They hosted and actually brought in all the soccer players internationally from Poland that were actually going up the ranks to incubate the professional leagues here. Like it was this cultural hub that I saw. And even though they were all like hubbed together, I still saw the struggle. I still saw how much they had to do with music. It wasn't just for entertainment reasons. It was for sustenance. It was for survival. It was for survival, may it be physical, financial, but also just psychological. Um, which was interesting because the only time we played music at home was when we didn't play that much music at home because it was their job. But if it was played, it was something that they really wanted to listen to, or I really wanted to listen to.
Hmm.
So even just thinking about that to your really great question is like there was, if we're going to put on that record, I really want to put on that record. If you're going to do something, you got to really know you want to do it. Because you're going to have to stick it out, and nothing's going to be easy. Anything worth it's not going to be easy.
No
So
worries.
yeah, that's what that phrase ultimately means to myself, and I think, most folks around me.
That's really meaningful. I wonder if one of our almost touch points was the Peaches show at Warsaw back in probably the late 90s. I was definitely at that show. Um,
I love that
so,
one.
or not. So there's, I think, connected to this, there's another thing you mentioned in our pre-chat about, you said it took a long time for you to realize that going into the detail of things is fun, but zooming out to a bigger picture is really important. And you like this process of connecting the dots. I'm sure this led to your certainly your current career and certainly your career before at SoundCloud too, and maybe at Warner as well. And I really think this is a superpower of yours. I think that, this zooming out, digging into a problem to understand it, you seem to have a real skill at not just addressing the mechanics of the problem, but in looking broader and sort of crafting a really holistic approach that reinforces whatever solution it is you're trying to implement. So you did this with fan powered royalties, which we'll talk about in a bit. But by focusing not just on the initial problem, which is money from a distribution, but also by looking at sort of downstream effects that might be beneficial to reinforce this new approach to income distribution, like identifying superfans and allowing artists and the teams to access them. So can you talk about this holistic approach, and is it always part of your process?
I think it's just this like inherent thing that I like doing. It's like people in my family who love to cook, right? There's different reasons that they love to cook. Like some
Hmm.
like it because they like the process, some like it because they get to play with the ingredients and figure out what works. For different reasons. And I'm admittedly I'm an awful cook, just so you know. But when it comes to this question, this kind of thing, this type of thinking, I love doing it. I'd even say to like simplify it, it's about, and I didn't realize this phrase until I had to write it down. It's essentially thoughtful design, and it's like what you do as a musician or a songwriter or a producer, right? You have an inkling of something, maybe an idea, an ideation, or a sound, or whatever it is, and you start to chase it because there is something that started that anchored the idea, and then you start to essentially design whatever it is that you're thinking of, and or architect or whatever it is that you want to, whatever term. And music is kind of that way. Like I always tended to approach music from a more architecting, producer, songwriter perspective than a performer, but then that came as a latter thing. And I love building like that. And then the business side is similar, except I think there's more of an emphasis to be proactive in your thoughtful design. And being around people, executives, leaders, all the way back to 2003 to date, and seeing the things that those teams back at that, what I was just describing, and those people that I was working with who are still huge in the industry, just watching them, right? That concept of design and how everyone does it differently. you just, to your point, you figure out what you do naturally, and then you have to figure out, and I had to figure out how to actually, refine that. How do I cultivate the way I'm trying to communicate to myself? What am
Hmm.
I even trying to do? And I think the thing is, the most challenging thing in music business is finding that anchor or that crux or that something that makes you go, ah, that's something that we should start building upon. And usually everyone always says, find the problem to build a solution for. But I really do think that's too one-dimensional because it's almost like that's almost just trying to find a problem and then figuring out a solution as opposed to, yeah, find something, but then define it. Is it, then question if it's a problem? Because then it's like the remuneration thing, streaming economy and all that. It was a
Hmm.
problem, it's a problem. But to your point and question is, well, if we change the way we pay, there's going to be some that really benefit from it. There's others that won't, or some will make the same amount of money. But what are you really flipping? What are you really changing? What are you really adding value in addition to, maybe is the question. And that was when the realization with the small team that I started iterating with at SoundCloud, now many years ago,
Hmm.
um, was wait a second. If you change the way you pay, whatever it is, even if it's not music streaming, whatever it is, inherently the data that you share about calculation and consumption and metrics, that has a different value because you're counting something, you're calculating, you're leveraging things differently. There's the incentives shift, right? You move away from the simple one-dimensional mathematical principle of the most plays wins, which is almost egregious to think about applying that to something as emotional as music. So that was interesting to challenge that. And then the realization, because all we do is talk about market share. Market share just simply means size. But what happens if you pay on the basis of every single individual's listener behavior and their listener share? Then we're talking about really deep, rich data, right? You find out who, on this entire call, most of their listener share is going to a given artist or scene or label. That's literally how the money's calculated and say in this new paradigm, then the data is valuable in a different way. And that's where with the team where I started, you know, taking those dots, collecting them, figuring out and framing it and building out this new model, but in the realization that data is going to be incredibly valuable. And
Hmm.
when everyone, it was, this is about 5 years ago when
Hmm.
we started to iterate and become more public and start speaking to rights holders, privately and just saying, we're going to be rolling this out in a year. We're only going to do it with, 130,000 direct creators, and we're going to start rolling out to rights holders. And there was a particular way of architecting that we didn't have to ask everyone's permission, which is a whole complicated, like two
Right.
ecosystems built side by side. But without going into that,
Hmm.
it was a way to say, by the way, we really do believe that we can build a fan-based economic model where the individual drives the value. And I could share this stat because we wrote a paper years back with Will Page. He and I co-wrote something that I think came out finally about a year or two ago. And one of the stats that we had was we secured a license. The first license of a large rights holders that we secured was with Warner, and then followed by that with Merlin, our friends at Merlin. But what was interesting is the entirety of Warner and their artists' global catalog had no idea that SoundCloud for them shifted to user-centric. And I think it was like about 2 months later in August, Little Uzi Vert was releasing a new record. And this is just a fantastic example of quantifying what I just said. Uh,
Hmm.
he leaks 3 tracks on SoundCloud because that's where he originally developed and came from. He knows that's where his fan base is. I think it was even against his label's knowledge, but it galvanized all fans. It made everyone from the internet show up to SoundCloud, and it just created this whole just everyone was consuming, engaging, commenting, and all this. And then I think just, 3 days later, the record came out. But what was interesting is that his body of work is pretty extensive, and remixes and features and everything. So he has a large body of work. So the reason I'm emphasizing that is that we had this theory. We knew what the data looked like for almost 2 years after building it. But this was the first real live example of fans show up, they come and stream the hell out of an artist, and they sit with that artist and their body of work, which is significant for the majority of that first month, and then second month, and then so on. So the stat is this: 6.5% of the total audience that was listening to Little Uzi Vert made up 72% of his entire payout under user-centric. And again,
I was going
that's
to mention a similar stat later.
so that's even
Good for
more.
you for putting it out there first.
That's even like, I know there's Pareto score dynamics that most people want. That's even more beautiful than a Pareto score of 80/20. Like that's 6.5% with condensed engagement and just giving most of their time in a given month to an artist and their body of work to give them almost 3/4 of everything that's coming to them in that month. And everyone, anyone that we were talking to, they should be asking, oh my God, I need to know who that 6.5% is. I need to know who they are. Those are the people who buy my tickets, they'll buy my merch, or they'll adopt Web3 if that's something that the artist cares about. So that was reinforced. And before this, and part of the Warner deal and other deals that we delivered was developing a fan tool. And that was someone, Matt Young, who was on my team. We worked quite closely throughout a lot of this, especially on the commercial proposition of this, which was.
Shout out to Matt in the chat, by the
Oh,
way.
he's in there?
Yeah, he's
Oh,
in there.
look at this.
Along with Dick Wingate and Dan Sisla and just
Oh my
a
God.
litany of people, Sam Tall, a
Oh
whole
my
bunch of
God.
people I haven't had the chance to mention yet. Thank you, Paul, for
There we
showing
go. Look
up.
at this. Raul, he was part of that crew.
Yep.
Yeah, no, there's a bunch of people. Oh, amazing. Anyways, great to see you all or see your names. But again, it was that prospect that this team and those people were all getting behind the fact that we realized if we created the model and we actually also gave access to that data, the fan tool and all of
hmm
that, it ultimately creates the bigger proposition here. And I think that really, if there's one thing that we could take credit for that I haven't really said, over interviews and conversations and chats, is that I do think that the team from that era, we could take credit for the super fan trend that is very prevalent today.
It sounds like it.
And we knew because there was conversations with some major folks that, there's disagreements, which always happen, and this, like it's good to have disagreement because then it goes back to the thing. We figure out what we mutually want, right? To your question about that one phrase that I had.
hmm
What do we ultimately both want and can agree on? But it didn't get there. It's fine. But in the end, that trend, that understanding of we're looking at this value proposition one-dimensionally, that did at least come out of that, and it did, influence the market generally.
That's you hit on so many points in there. I'm gonna I think I'm actually gonna transition you to a little bit of a lightning round
Okay.
where I just want you to give some I want you to well, first let's sort of set the stage. So um you were Warner, you moved to SoundCloud. Was there lightning round? Was there a particular what was the availability of this fan powered opportunity, the thing that brought you there? No.
No, no, it was to come on to head their economics and rights admin globally. A
hmm
part of the initial onboarding was the reason I saw the I wouldn't call it the gap, but the legal and licensing opening to do it
hmm
because I had to go through all the agreements and all the licenses, which are by far the most complicated I've seen in the industry, and the team that's on here, former Clouders can attest to, and who's on here? Oh, Daniel Susla.
Yep.
You can see him there. Like these guys, these people, they know too that those agreements are the most complex for various reasons. But one of them is because that platform in particular is a UGC platform that built a DSP within it. So in order to retain that UGC platform capability, the economics and things are complicated to be able to allow and capture that. But one of the things that happened is that platform, that company can treat every user, every creator, if they own their own rights, they themselves can be deemed the rights holder. And that was the beginning of the idea. That was that anchor of being able to realize, wait a second, we're able to monetize directly with these creators individually. And that
Mhm.
started happening with Chance the Rapper, I think was one of the first, and a few others. And at that time when I came on in 17 or 18,
Mhm.
um, there was under 100 artists, but that was when we realized this is an opening. We should grow this. And it went from that sub
And
100.
there and those were artists that had where they own both sides, where they own the publishing and
Exactly.
the okay.
Exactly. So that kind of gave the opportunity to then technically they were licensing directly with the platform, which you couldn't really do with the others.
Hmm.
That was really the vehicle. That was the wait a second, this is how we can get around the paradigm and the
Hmm.
challenge of asking everyone, majors, indies, DIYs, aggregators, and people that own their own rights on pro rata, asking
Hmm.
them all to move. We just built the second model for everyone I just mentioned, but we just end up moving the licenses piece by piece when someone agrees to actually get this payout and the data. So that was the real commercial proposition and shift that moved the needle. But
And you did actually, so I know you worked with Mark Eisenberg,
Mhm.
who I knew from my Sound Exchange days. But you worked with him on some licenses from publishers too, right?
Yes. Yeah, we worked across those deals that, yeah, I mean, Raul, the team, Daniel, these guys were in those negotiations. Yeah, and some of them Mark and I would go into, and I would be the econ head, sitting next to him to play the negotiation game with the
Provide the
others.
data.
And there's one that I won't mention, but I will mention I in my entire career and time doing this stuff, I've never negotiated against fiction except once.
Okay.
And and Mark was there for that one, which was just amazing because we got a presentation of what the license should be, and the company should be earning 10x what they make,
Hmm.
all these other things. And then it was amazing I think this was the moment where I really got to know Mark, where, he's trying to figure out how to have this conversation, and where I just couldn't help it. I was like, just want to mention, first of all, I know we're not 10x and we'll never be 10x our revenue in the term of this agreement.
Hmm.
But also, I think your math is wrong halfway through that slide. And we were told, don't worry about it. It's fine. And it was just one of those moments where you bond very quickly when you have to deal with something like that.
Indeed, and I mean you just also to bounce around a little bit here, but set some context. So you mentioned to me at one point, shouldn't streaming reward individuality?
Hmm.
And I think that the thinking there was tied to, if you're a kid who's into EDM, should your money be going towards EDM? And one of the ways that you found to explain this some years ago. I was looking through your old posts. You talked about what the club world would have been like if it was pro rata. I actually loved that explanation. But maybe you could let's keep it concise, but because there's so much more I want to ask you. But um, talk about that a little bit. Talk about the rewarding individuality and rewarding a scene and why you felt like this was the vehicle to do that.
And wait, what was the thing that you saw? The club roll? What
Oh,
was
you
that?
mentioned you mentioned something in one of your older interview or one of your older interviews where you said imagine if the club world was pro rata. So in other words, if all the clubs were aggregated together.
Yes. Yeah,
Go,
yeah, yeah. I remember.
go.
Yeah, so I think the huge I mean, everything from the UK parliamentary hearings from 4 years ago, when COVID really started to iterate and create all the tension and aggression and debate about streaming because everyone's touring money was gone and they started looking at their statements, not realizing how egregious streaming is to their bottom line. I think just starting there and then going all the way down to today is no matter, even if you are some artist that participates in the headlines of the pro rata world, meaning that you do own a very healthy share of the market share dynamic, one day you will not be there. That's another thing that I just want to call out. I don't think we've ever said or I have ever called out because at some point you will become niche catalog. And I think that's why I just want to call that out because the beauty of music actually is when it becomes something scarce and niche and it becomes something in itself because there's so much of it, especially these days, that culturally someone's hope should be in the longevity of their career and time and even beyond them. There is something that they've parked and owned something, in the real estate of music creatively. Like that thing is them or him or her, right? And I think that's the problem with pro rata. Like you're just thinking about the club thing. It was just when I used to go to the club scene as a younger little man. Um, I just remember
I
like
bet
I
you still
remember
go.
what I just remember, hey, I played at those clubs underage. I DJ'd at them. So like I was there a little early and we might have overlapped.
I was there. I was there.
You were there.
I was there.
But yeah, we paid to get into a club for the particular thing that was going on there. And you knew who was playing, what was playing, and you know, of the 5, 10, whatever things that was going on, you're still paying towards either that whole group or they took your name down, they took it down like who are you here to see?
Hmm.
Here to see A, I'm here to see B, or you just say I'm generally here to see everything, which would be contributed to that. But at least you're there for a particular reason, particular night, and you're there for that, community genre or whatever it is. Now, streaming is more like just getting the entire city of New York together on one night, all the clubs together, and everyone's throwing their money together, and it just depends who has the most attendance gets the most money. So that means I show up to the Tunnel or Twilo, and I'm paying to get in, but then most of my money is going to Madison Square Garden that has some other show that has nothing to do with my music at all.
Yeah.
And even though I might have even I don't know, I might have even spent more money. Um, so that's the real nuance when you deal with something as behaviorally precious as music, to apply an economic principle of market share is strange. It's understandable in the beginning because it was meant to convince an industry to move to a new paradigm. It's simple, it's auditable, I get it. But this goes back to that principle of proactive, thoughtful design. At the time, it should have been understood this is good. We'll see if we outgrow it in X amount of years. If we do, we should start to think about how we have to evolve it. And that was
And
really,
of course, some of that's happening,
yes,
and we're gonna get to that. But I mean, maybe another way to look at this is another thing that I know you've said in the past, which is, you know, you've talked about fragmentation of audience in the music industry and sort of why fragmentation means it doesn't make a lot of sense to compare I think you said a stoner rock track that's 20 minutes long with a 3-minute pop track. And that's effectively what's happening with Pro Rata.
exactly. It should be if I pay my $10, $11 and I'm listening to stoner rock and some other things a given month and it takes me because it's longer content, I have literally less plays for whatever content it is. It should just mean that that's how my listener share gets divvied up, as opposed to the whole. And it's just I know many people push back on this and they say, what's the reason you're just divvying up money differently? That is a massive, massive difference. And the other thing to caveat too is there's superstars that have so much fandom, like concentrated, it's like fattening the head of fandom amongst this long tail of audience.
Hmm.
They have so much in there that they make more money in this model. But they're the type of, artists that just they cultivate fans within their audience in a different way than others maybe that have a bigger audience, but it's a different kind of engagement that others might not make as much, in the model. But the beauty of it is, and this was the thing, is the industry needed to do a leap of faith, is that even if it's more or less the same, doesn't matter. When you get the data, when you have access to fans, you could DM them through SoundCloud. I don't know if they still have that or not, but we built that. And you have access to see who are the people that are that 6.5%. You can start to actually then learn how to leverage that business, how to leverage that fandom. Like that's the whole point, is you take maybe the risk in that short immediate to then learn how to well, because you have to also unlearn 10 plus years of pushing playlists and doing different tactics in terms of marketing and pushing content. So not easy.
Yeah, we were I remember after our night of beers, the first call I made walking home from the club was to Sharky Laguana, who was a very early proponent of this particular metric for distribution. And I was over the moon. I was like, you're not going to believe who I just met. Anyway, he and I traveled around for a long time in the 2014, 2015, going to conferences, South by Southwest, meet him, presenting this idea. And so it really was an exciting validation to see, somebody, you and your team launch it. And I'm just curious, you said you started out with artists who had both sides, but then I know you did a deal with Merlin. You talked about that, and then a deal with Warner. And I'm just curious how that impacted the pool or the distribution, or what insights can you share about contextualizing results during that time?
So to reveal a little bit, because now we can. Um, uh, I think Matt knows this because I shared this email with him not that long ago because I found it. But it was early on. We launched. I think we launched it to those direct creators. It was like March or April of 21. And a few months after that, and kudos to the CEO at the time, Mike Weisman, for taking that risk. There was a lot of pushback from certain groups. We ended up doing that, and a few months after that, in that summer, we started, there was the question, okay, what are the next steps? And literally the proposal that I had was we grow the direct creators that own all their rights a little bit more. We get Warner and we get Merlin, and that's more than 50% of all consumption on the platform, which then SoundCloud can legitimately say it's a fan economy, not a
Hmm.
streaming economy. And of course, anyone else that was willing to get on board. Like, we were open, we had dialogues with every major, every party that we could, friends and family and former coworkers.
Hmm.
But those are really the targets because we knew what we knew, and we knew that if we did that, then it's legitimately more than 50% of all activity would have been under user-centric and would have this fan data. And that was really the kind of push, and it ended up happening. I mean, I think the team, the crew here on the chat, and others like Amma Walton and others that aren't here, I think all of us collectively had, a couple of strokes through the process on those first deals. But the actually going back to the theme that you asked at the beginning of this call is no, we believed in it. Like, we knew what we were sitting on. We knew how much this would change not just that platform, but inform the greater music market, what's possible. I just recently had a call with folks at Domino, and I met someone there
Hmm.
during the intro, just mentioned, time at SoundCloud and what we did, and she very kindly said, "Oh, yeah, that's been lucrative for us ever since." And it's like that's those moments of where you just go, "That's great to hear." I hope you guys are still extending your licenses, but but
Let
if
me ask you, let me ask you a related question to this. Some of the pushback that I know exists, on this are A, it's going to be technically too complicated, or from the other side, it's going to be too complicated for a label to sort of explain this distribution to their different artists, why you earned one thing and why you earned another thing. Is that how have you, what's your reaction to
The
those thoughts?
the lucky thing on the technical side was SoundCloud had no third-party dependencies in their royalty engines or calculation systems. So that was SoundCloud when it created, like, the engineering and development teams and the founders were, they were very aspirational to Google. So they did very little buying, mostly building. Um, so that was, coming on, actually, when I came on, that was one of the reasons. And I think Raul was one of the key people here that felt the most pain of that, even by the time some of us came on, is it just by building everything yourself, there's a lot of dependencies technically, not just, externally. It was
Hmm.
challenging to get it up to speed and fix things over the years. But once we were able to, it gave us the complete liberty to do anything.
To do anything. I want to address a question that's in the chat here from
Yeah.
Kevin Klager. He says, "Call me contrarian, but both pro rata and user centric have winners and losers, and neither truly addresses the diminishing middle class of artists." So you had, I read or we discussed at some point, the your thoughts about, is this just rearranging the deck chairs, or does this create a new opportunity even for those artists who don't have large fan bases, but who just have a lot of streams? Like, but can you dive into that and maybe respond to Kevin's question?
I apologize for my directness, but it absolutely addresses the middle class because, and more specifically, any middle class of artists that are in niche genres of music. Um, if let's just say I'm a jazz head and the new generation of jazz musicians, which are, I mean, I can imagine they have a very, very, very hard time in the market today. But I'm a jazz head, and that's all I do. I listen to jazz, and I pay my subscription every month. And I do listen to a lot of contemporary and whatever other acts. That means that they get a significant share of my $11 a month. That's very different than me streaming that much and then going into the, debatable void of a streaming pool and then, competing for a share of money across the entirety of all music consumption and against genres that have nothing to do with my individual taste. Because I think that's the other thing that's really hard to understand when you're talking about these economics is that there is direct tie between my individual listener behavior and where my money goes. There is nothing similar between that and the pro rata way of managing how we pay artists.
And how do you define middle class? Sam Tall asks, median income to ex median based on which country, platform's curve of artist pay brackets.
But
Um,
yeah, I mean, middle class, I mean, just based on seeing someone's note here, I mean, I would just say middle class is someone that's a working musician artist that are making a living, from music, but having a hard time even having any support from streaming, meaning that they have middle class revenues coming from other means, but they need to have, if they had that influx from streaming, that would actually push them a little further in terms of just comfort. Um,
okay.
there was artists, I don't remember if there was some studies that were done that we did with Media. Um, I think it was I can't remember if it was 22 or 21, but we did share a significant amount of data with them to show to answer this exactly with a third party to do that on our behalf. So it's evident that we were being, open about the data and what it does for independence in that middle class.
Yep.
And it did, I mean, I'd definitely recommend to referencing it.
Hmm.
And I think it's on one of the earlier posts at Forms and Shapes. I do believe it's in there. But they will be able to highlight that middle class. It's basically artists that are already, let's just say, developing in their own right, no matter
That are
how,
developing.
yeah,
Okay.
no matter how niche though. That's the thing. Developing meaning, if you have 1,000 listeners,
Yep.
I'm talking about that being already significant because that's 1,000 people repeatedly coming back and listening. 1,000 listeners is not anything in the, Spotify, Apple, pro rata, whatever means of pro rata, because that's not enough plays to move and pull gravity out of a, pro rata pool of revenue. But 1,000 people spending however much of their month listening to you amongst, however many
Hmm.
others. That's
Oh my God, we have got 5 minutes left, and I've got so many questions. Frank Woodworth is here. There's so many people that are here that I want to get through their questions.
yeah.
So we're gonna buzz through this real quick. There have been changes, and I mean the market has grown since you launched this thing. Universal launched their artist-centric model.
Mhm.
Martin Mills has talked about in order to combat AI in music, maybe we ought to charge everybody a small charge, flat fee for uploading music. If you're a content creator, music creator, I hate that word content. Um, uh, Talk about that quick. You got about a minute to go into it because too many other things I want to ask you.
Yeah, so quickly, artist-centric, I do applaud its attempt. I don't think it's a solution by any means in comparison to the others. It's still based on pro rata.
Hmm.
I don't think introducing thresholds is a solution. I think we introduced an economic lever that's harder to negotiate out of agreements, and people can just ratchet the numbers up over the years. So I think it's in the right direction, but not the actual direction that's necessary. And then I think what Mills was saying in terms of adding other, avenues for people to spend money that they have that just don't know how to spend it or where to put it, I think also is a good idea. It just needs to be something that can be comfortably scaled and understood by the general consumer of music. Because then I think you need to educate people to behave like fans. It's not just going to fans and trying to squeeze them. I think the bigger need is to get people to start to realize, oh shit, I actually am a fan of music because I didn't realize because I'm too young to know because I've come to music post era of
You know,
of streaming.
I want to share some stats that I think I know you know all these stats already, but Media has done a lot of work on the user-centric model, the fan-powered model, and just to call out a couple things. So they've said, for instance, that 10% of the artists under the new model see 80% of the payouts coming from 20% or less of their listeners. So there's the super fan statistic. They've said that 97% of fans contribute more than $5 a month to a single artist, which also is super interesting. They have said that um, that more artists move up into higher income brackets. They said increases, for instance, in the $100 to $1,000 segment. There's a 10% increase, $1,000 to $10,000, there's a 9% increase, and over 10,000, there's a 1.9% increase. So it does reinforce this idea that there's a class of working musicians, middle class
Mhm.
musicians, that are sort of that this process remunerates mid and long tail artists better than pro rata, and I think that's reinforced by the very specific study that Media did.
Yeah, those are great stats, and I think that's the one to really dive in on when talking about that developing emerging middle class, definitely. The other thing to call out too is even if someone doesn't see as much of a shift in what they do, they see an uplift in streaming numbers and payout. They still then have that's the other side of the coin is they have the fan tool to see who's driving that value. You connect with them, thank them, or some of them that are showing a little bit of fan-like affinity that you kind of again reach out. If it's 1,000 people, you can do it. And that's why that other side of that coin is so important. The other thing to call out the reason me and the team didn't get fired for building this without executive approval was because, by the way, we did this on the side for a little while before we brought it to everyone's attention, is we used it as a fraud tool. Because the other thing is if you go from pro rata to user centric and the payout goes like this, it
Mhm.
just skyrockets up. There's some fan behavior that's being stifled by the economic model of pro rata. If the money goes like this, then there's something really fishy going on and bolstering plays and doing all of that on pro rata. So that was the other thing is the way that we're also, it's not just, something that's meant to reward fandom and reward individual behavior and help, middle class and superstars with massive fandom within their audiences. It was also to curb fraud and bad acting and people abusing pro rata, which is very susceptible to fraud too. Um, just to call that out.
Okay, I know we're at the top of the hour. We can maybe go a few minutes long, and I want to go a few minutes long just to talk about what you're doing now. So your current work with Forums Plus Shapes, which is your consultancy. So you had this great experience at SoundCloud, doing M&A and to integrated businesses, working with artists, and there's sort of all components in helping C-suites, I guess, identify priorities, which I think is a focal point of your consultancy work.
Mhm.
Um, we have a lot of overlapping thinking here too about how to focus a consultancy. I'm focused on revenue optimization, for instance. And as I understand it, you have a framework for your consulting called the Four Corners. Can you talk about that real quick?
Sure. Yeah, so Four Corners is something that I ended up devising in previous strategic roles and leadership roles where, I mean, like we tie it back to Poland or any country's history, but essentially think of the borders of any country over the hundreds of years, it moves over time. But there's always the definition of whatever it is, that body, country, whatever it is, it still has four corners that define where it is and what it is. So when working with C-suites, especially ones that are smaller, it's challenging to get them to agree to something. So what I would do is I would take the strategy org and say, this is what the four corners, this is what the strategic strategy org, we define this as the four corners. This is what we think are the most prioritized areas that define us as a company or as a platform or whatever it may be. And then leave it to them to debate that. Whatever comes, sometimes they debate different corners in and out of it. Sometimes there's an agreement or doesn't agree to disagree. And then you have that solidified. But I think the amazing thing is going through that process to define those four corners. One is can be arduous, but really rewarding. But when you finally get to that point, what's really interesting, product decisions, business decisions, partnership decisions, all these things are so much easier because you could say, does that hit any of the four corners? Or more importantly, does it hit any of the intersections, which is even more valuable because it's hitting multiple. And that's something that like mentally, the reason I devised that was just a very tangible way of talking through what do we care about? What hits our bottom line? What can we, further develop or build out? So it's again going to your earlier questions of like, it's collecting the dots to connect the dots, but then really leveraging everything, right? And figuring out what do we do the best? What are we the best at? Or what are we really good at that we don't realize that we're not tapping into? So yeah, that's kind of this approach that sometimes for some people I work with where it's we start with that process and it's a really interesting experience because people start saying, I never thought about it this way, like really articulating and putting it onto a map.
Hmm.
That's what we end up calling it. Like what's on the map? Who are we? And it's always been really helpful and usually fruitful.
Very interesting. So, well, I'm going to try to cut this in 7 minutes, and we're going to go 10 minutes over. I apologize to everybody, but I hope you're all enjoying this. I want to talk for a minute about what made the clients you chose interesting to you. So I know one of your clients is Voice Swap, and that I
Mm.
believe grew out of this an interest in a sort of AI conundrum, rights owners wanting not doing a deal with any platform unless there was some kind of attribution. So can you talk a little bit about your work in that
Yeah.
area and also and go broader if you want into your other choices of clients?
So it's interesting. So when I formed the agency and I went out, I created my own four corners that I wanted to work in. And my mission was to have a client in each. And
Hmm.
if I could work with a client in each, I cover what I think is the most important areas of the entire market. Um, and one of them key ones was AI, but I specifically was interested in the creator side, let's call it the creator tool side that overlaps with IP. And VoiceSwap was initially when they were forming, Ben Jordan reached out to me, who's also one of the co-founders. And they at inception, they were wrestling with how to monetize the platform and how to monetize the business. So I came in originally as an advisor, but then I got so wrapped up in everything that I became a co-founder quite quickly. Excuse me. And it's really that kind of thing where I used my own four corners to realize where do I think is the most important areas to get involved in, and where could I contribute the most. But what I realized in that moment when they were walking me through everything, we had the opportunity to monetize that technology for voice at inference, not at the output, at inference. And what I mean by that is people were treating voice technology to say, I'm going to do everything I'm doing. I'm swapping voices, doing inference, voice to voice conversions, and then I come out with an output, and then I put it out into the ether and to streaming platforms. And that's when we monetize it. When working with this crew at the beginning of it, realizing that we could monetize, and that's their intention, was to monetize as you're just using it, as you're doing it in your DAW, as you're doing it just to work, just to demo and create. By monetizing that, we created a new revenue stream. And by doing that, you technically are creating new real estate of intellectual property. And that was the moment where I said, I want to be a part of this. Like this is going to change things. It's going to be a long-term, prospect in terms of a strategic opportunity. It will
Hmm.
shape policy. So yeah, and ever since then, I've been involved in like a lot of policy organizations, and so I have a dual role there for strategy and impact. So I've been working on a lot of legislative efforts in the UK, part of the coalition out there that's responsible for Make It Fair campaign. So that's been one of those things that a client opportunity quickly turned in 3 weeks to a co-founder opportunity. But it's that principle of stepping back, like you said at the beginning of the call, and being like, what are we looking at here together? And also that team is amazing. Like it's important to have the right people there to be able to say, this is what we're trying to do, and then admitting we're not sure about this, and then having that really great rapport of being able to just, you know, cook something in the kitchen that you weren't expecting to with those ingredients. And that was one of them. And there's obviously Rostrum Pacific that I've been working with for some time. They developed a distribution company that I helped them get the licenses and all the deals with the platforms, but then also then helping them build it out in the business, which got them a partnership with a company called Surreal that does attribution, which also is working with. So it's really trying to be at the front. For me in particular, it's being at the front lines of all these areas. At the same time, the benefit for working with everyone is then being able to work with each other. Um, which in a weird way, now that I'm thinking about all the questions you asked, it goes back to that beginning, which is like when you go into the office and you go to the nightlife, you're kind of merging the two a bit, and you're just kind of the culture and the business are a little closer and dare I say overlapping.
Dare I say overlapping? Um, okay, let's see how much I can crunch this into 2 minutes. Um, so, um, well, I have three things left I wanted to ask you, and I see Marcus has a question too. Um, ca- can you answer Marcus's question real quick in the chat? Would you say that global music policy is downstream of music policy in the UK?
Um, so at the moment right now, from what I can tell is, and I'm trying to push for, is to use music as the canary in the coal mine. Um, and the reason for that is that other industries, in terms of policy and AI and all that whole issue, uh, unlike us in music, we have fraud problems with streaming in the mainline making revenues. So there's a lot of economic studies that are coming out soon out there, which I'm involved in. So
Hmm.
it's, yeah, in a way, people are realizing that they need to use music as usual as the first policy case to be like, this is where we need to figure out regulation and policy or potential shaping, which would, could be carbon copied almost on all the others, but it's,
Okay.
you never know.
Quick question and an insight. The
Yeah.
question is, you and I have both built careers off sort of figuring out the next thing in music. How do you do it? Is it directly connected to your this idea of zooming out on a problem, or is it your four corners? Is it a combination of everything? Is there some different thing that sort of says, this is something I want to focus on versus this is something I don't?
I'd say it's a combination of instinctually listening to yourself when you step out, being honest to yourself, and then having conversations like this. Because you could miss so many beats. Like when we had our first chat for like, I don't know how many, 20 hours over however many beers. It was, you need
I'm
to be
still
shaking.
drunk from that.
you need to be shaken out of your comfort zones too, even when you're thinking about it. But I do a lot of, yeah, I love reflecting, long walks, sitting in the dark. I'm kidding. No, but like things of that nature that yeah, I if I'm trying to think if what you took away from me would probably take that away from me is probably having that opportunity to reflect deeply. I think
You know, speaking of reflecting, I mean, I'm going to kind of wind it down with this.
but
You this could have been just random, but I noticed that the running order of articles on your blog sort of starts from very technical focused articles and is moving to a more humanistic side. And I have to say that's one of the things I love about you is your human side. You mentioned to me at one point that you were a huge fan of Dune, which I immediately knew we were going to be friends when you told me that. I taught my kids, my little girls, the litany against fear before I put them to bed. Of course I did, right? So anyway, um, you know, was that a progression? Or, I mean, are you broadening your scope, or has that just always been who you were?
I've always I think business models are always technically philosophical frameworks, maybe is maybe a funny way of saying it, but like yeah, I think there's a lot of that in me that I've decided to finally just put a little bit more in my writing with a lot of things that are going on privately and publicly. But I think the Dune one, if anyone reads the one about systems, I think it's called the Beautiful Mess or A Beautiful Mess. That one in particular was inspired by one of the latter Dune books, just because it's like realizing how how insignificant, but yet, significant we are as individuals and, just about systems and operations. And that goes back to that question of four corners. How do you zoom out? How do you zoom in? Like that Dune book in particular made me, start, you know what? I just needed to write a little bit from the heart.
You said when we talked before we left, and this is the last thing I'm going to say. You said, I may be small, but I'm not insignificant.
That's it. That's it. That's
Great. On that note, you are not insignificant, Mike.
it. There you
Thank
go.
you so much for this time from
No,
you.
thank you.
This
Thank you
was a
both.
huge pleasure on my part to be able to do this. And thank you, Tom, for the
Mine.
platform.
No,
Hey,
thank you.
Dick, thank you for bringing Mike. I love it when I live up to the billing of the smartest guys in the room. You two have slayed it today, and I knew you would. So thank you so much.
Thank you,
Thank you to
Tom.
the audience for hanging in here a little bit overtime, but it was well worth it. You got rewarded. I promised you would leave today more inspired than and enlightened than you arrived. I guarantee you we delivered on that. We'll be here next week, and I look forward to seeing you all. If you're traveling this weekend, be safe, be nice to each other, and we'll see you next time. Take care, folks.
Thank you so much.
Thanks all.